Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our summer 2023 Institute, How Archaeology is Changing What We Know About Medieval West Africa. I'm Brenda Randolph, the co-director, along with Dr. Vanessa Oyugi of Outreach at the Center for African Studies at Howard University. And a very important part of our center's team is our technology guru, Ania Ueno. Do you have any instructions for us, Ania?
Hi, everyone. Yes, if all the participants could please keep their videos and audio off, that way we can fully focus on the presentations and enjoy the Institute.
And I'm also very happy to introduce Dr. Helen from Howard University School of Education. And Dr. Bond will manage the Q&A and our breakout discussion. And now Vanessa will introduce Dr. Sarah Guerin, moderator of our panel discussion this morning. Vanessa.
Thank you, Brenda. Yes, we are very pleased to have Sarah Guerin with us this morning. Sarah Guerin is Assistant Professor of Medieval Art in the History of the Art Department at the University of Pennsylvania. Her research centers on the material conditions of medieval art, with an emphasis on the socio-economic circumstances surrounding production and use. And these interests have led her to engage seriously with the material culture of Africa contemporary with the European Middle Ages, and especially the role trans-Saharan trade routes play in the medieval economic system. And this research led her to contributing to the award-winning exhibition, Caravans of Gold, Fragments in Time, Art, Culture, and Exchange Across Medieval Saharan Africa. And this is how we found Sarah, and we're very excited to have her here this morning as the moderator. Sarah, welcome.
Thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Brenda. Thank you to everyone at the Center for African Studies at Howard University for the invitation to be with you today and to share some of this material. I want to just really briefly kind of frame how I came to this material and the questions that kind of orient the discussions that we're going to have. So I was trained as a Western medieval specialist. So really my area of study is primarily in France, England, Germany, and Italy. But my area of specialty was ivory carving. So that is works of art that were carved in Western Europe from elephant ivory. And this very quickly, and so I'm showing you a lovely example here that's at the that was at the Royal Abbey of Saint Denis, just outside of Paris during the Middle Ages, to get a sense of what this type of carving is. But very early in my dissertation and kind of throughout my research, I was really interested in the material itself, so in elephant ivory, and really in the question of how did it get to Western Europe in the 1200s and the 1300s of the Common Era. So this led me really early to publishing on the trans-Saharan trade routes that brought the primary material of elephant teeth from the regions of Africa where there were elephants abundantly in the Middle Ages. And so that really is West Africa and South Africa. And so you can see that there are a number of trans-Saharan routes, and then also a route that goes through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea through and then up the Nile. And this is really where my encounter with African archaeology happened. And because the archaeological sources that were being assembled and written by colleagues working on the ground, I found to be the best and richest source of evidence for answering my historical questions. So this leads me to kind of a number of points that I want us to keep in mind throughout the discussion that we're having, and then also through the question and answer period and your breakout sessions. And the first point is about the term medieval, which we have used in the promotional material. And I want us to think about this really carefully. Medieval is a term which just literally means in Latin, Middle Ages, media aevum. And that poses the question, well, the middle of what, of course? And the answer to that is it's in the middle period between the fall of the ancient Roman Empire and the dawn of the Italian Renaissance. So two very Eurocentric political and cultural concepts. And so in other words, this goes from around the year 400 to 1450, we can say, quite roughly. So it's an important kind of an important point to remember then when we're talking about other parts of the globe outside of Europe, where these kind of bookending events did not take place, to what extent should the term medieval be used? It is, there's one kind of side of the argument that is very critical of using the term medieval in any area outside of Europe. On the other hand, I think there's an important point to make about the connectivity of North Africa and West Africa and East Africa with the political events that are named in these terms. So the Roman Empire on one hand, and the age of European expansion. And the other word that I want to have come to mind and be, which itself comes from the ancient Greek historia, meaning inquiry, knowledge, and a narrative. But really, in beginning with classical Latin, history began to refer to written knowledge, things that were fixed onto an external memory support. And so this is an important part of the construction of our disciplines, of how we think about the deep past, and gives us kind of some problematic dichotomies or kind of two-part arguments, is if you're thinking of history as only what concerns the written word, what do you do with cultures that do not have writing systems as part of their cultural production, as complicated and developed as they are? And this leads us to terms like prehistory, being used for quite sophisticated cultures up until the moment where they adopt either Arabic as a writing system or one of the European languages, as is frequently the case. So I want us to keep that term in mind, specifically also when we're thinking about our topic today, which is archaeology. And archaeology then, and today of material culture, the artifacts that mostly, but not exclusively, the sort of digging that happens of uncovering things from the past that have been forgotten and untouched underground for centuries. And I'm making this point because it's a really powerful tool to tell us kind of a whole broad range of things about the deep past how normal people lived, how empires rose and fell. It gives us evidence about economic systems and trade, and much, much more besides. So one of the powers of archaeology versus history, the study of texts, is that it has the ability to tell much broader stories rather than only what people in the past thought were worth writing down. So that's why, for example, Roman archaeology is, still very important because it tells us the stories of the past that have been overlooked by the men, largely, who were writing down things of the past. So in particular, for the context of West Africa that we're going to be focusing on today, this is really useful because the period contemporaneous with the European Middle Ages, so that a kind of millennium 400 and 1400, there were no endogenous or locally written sources about what was happening in West Africa. Rather, what we have in terms of historical sources are Arabic texts that were written outside of Africa, largely in North Africa, Sicily, or Spain, in Islamic Spain, that are reporting events and giving accounts of everyday life in West Africa, and those reports are often deeply biased, and I have a lot of the problematic racialized biases already 1,000 years ago that we're still struggling with in the scholarship today. So I wanted to sort of lay out those terms as ideas for us to be grappling with throughout our discussion today. And I wanted to end with two maps, which I think are really useful for orienting ourselves with this discussion. The map on the left is quite a clever map that reminds us of the enormous geography of the continent of Africa and helps us to zoom in on the regions of West Africa that we're going to be concentrating on today as a geographic sphere that is the same size as the continental United States. And so it really is helpful in framing and delimiting the geographic zone that we're looking at today. The map on the right is one of my favorites to show, and then it's the Dixamian projection that was drawn or developed by Buckminster Fuller in the middle of the 20th century. And why I think this is a great map to look at is because it's a way of rendering the round globe on a flat, as a flat image that doesn't distort the size of the continents. It distorts, however, the size of the oceans if you look at the broader projection. But in looking at the continents in their proper proportions in an image like this, one readily sees the difference in size between Western Europe, which is so much has been the center of our academic pursuits and the kind of how history is taught within the academy and also within the school systems, and seeing how small that is versus the enormity of the African continent next to it. And so I'm hoping that these visuals encourage us to think about the proportionality of the histories that are represented in these lands in our discourses. So with that being said, that was kind of my kind of the preliminary material that I wanted to put forth, and to give you an idea of kind of the ideas that I have been thinking about in using the work of the two colleagues that I'll be in discussion with today, who I will introduce for you. So Joining us from his research site in Ghana is Dr. Jacques Aymeric Nsangou, who holds a BA and an MA in Archaeology and Cultural Heritage Management from the University of Yaoundé, Cameroon. And he received his PhD in 2016 from the University of Geneva in Switzerland, with a dissertation entitled, and I'm translating here, Defending One's Community in the Atlantic Era, a study on the endogenous fortifications in the Falémé Valley of Senegal. This groundbreaking study was published by Oxford's prestigious British Archaeological Report series in 2022, and it's available open access, and I encourage everyone to look it up. Since defending his dissertation, Dr. Aymeric Nsangou has held several postdoctoral positions, first at the University of Geneva, then at Harvard University's Center for Italian Renaissance Studies, ITATI, in Florence, as part of ITATI's new initiative to support the historical study of Africa and its material cultures. And he is currently a Swiss National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow in the Ceramic Technology Laboratory at the University of Manitoba in Canada. And that's not far from where I grew up. And I haven't yet asked Jacques how his first winter was. But in addition to his monograph, Dr. Aymeric Nsangou has published widely, including in his field's two most esteemed journals, the Journal of African Archaeology and Ania. His research has been supported by the Académie Suisse des Sciences Humaines et Sociales, the Irish Research Council, and the Deutsches Historisches Institute in Rome. And I am, and I think we all are, delighted that he has agreed to join this conversation today. And from the lovely island of Cyprus, we have Dr. Babatunde Babalola, who, after doing his bachelor's and master's at the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, received his PhD from the University of from Rice University in Texas in 2016. With a dissertation entitled Archaeological Investigations of Early Glass Production at Igbu Olokun, Ile-Ife in Nigeria. Dr. Babalola is currently holding two prestigious research positions as the Andrew Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow at the British Museum and as the Marie Curie Fellow at the Cyprus Institute in Aglazania in Cyprus. Previously, he held fellowships and research positions at the Center for African Studies at the University of Cambridge, in both the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research and in the Department of Anthropology at Harvard University, and at University College London's campus in Doha, Qatar. The list of Dr. Babalola's extensive publications runs 4 pages long, and that is single-spaced. But like his co-panelists, these include all of the top journals in the field, as well as Antiquity, the leading journal in ancient history and archaeology, as well as the trendy journal Post-Medieval. Tunde's trailblazing scholarship on glass bead production and technological innovation has been recognized with a number of awards, including but not limited to the Blaise O'Connor Award for Outstanding Research on a Global Scale from the World Archaeological Congress, and the recipient of the Field Discovery Award from the 4th Shanghai Archaeological Forum. He's currently working on 2 books, which are relevant to our discussion today. The first, a monograph on his study of glass beads, and the second, an edited volume, which he's preparing with the Cambridge-based archaeologist Paul Lane, entitled Archaeology, Heritage, and the Decolonization of Africans Past. And so thank you for both joining us. I invite Tunde and Jacques for you to put on your videos if your internet connections will support it. And I'll start with a couple of questions. So the first question that I would like to ask of you both is really pretty simple. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your path to become an archaeologist. What was your, let's say, kind of intellectual development? How did you get where you are today? And maybe Jacques, we could start with you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah, for this introduction. Thank you very much. And I'm really happy to be there with you today. After my graduation in high school, I went to the university. I wanted to be a historian, but I was not really happy to work in archives. So I looked, and finally I found the archaeology department. So it was a kind of more or less history. So I started at the University of Yaoundé in the Department of Archaeology. And as you can see on the first slide, it was a really interesting part for me because thanks to our university, we get to go to the field school, like on this photo. And next slide, please. And then I graduate with my master's in art and archaeology. I was working on the fortification in Western Cameroon. If you can go to the next slide, I can show you some image of this fortification who was built in the next slide, please. Yes, so in West Cameroon, yes. So this was the Bamouns people fortification built in the 18th century. And I made some archaeological excavation on it and also tried to connect this fortification to the Bamouns strategy of the occupation of the land and the creation of their kingdom. Later, next slide. I worked a bit in rescue archaeology in Eastern Cameroon, but this was a really short time before I started my PhD. Next slide. In Eastern Senegal at the University of Geneva as part of the archaeological research in the program in the Falémé Valley. The Falémé Valley is a river just located at the border between the Senegal Republic and Mali Republic. And you can see this is just an image of it. And at the left side is Mali, and the right side is Senegal. So that's why I did my PhD. And there I was working about African indigenous fortification. So I continued what I started in Cameroon. Next slide, please. And finally, I defend my PhD at the University of Geneva. And as Sarah said, this PhD was published as a monography. Yes, about our indigenous fortification in Eastern Senegal. I don't want to say unfortunately, but it's right in French. So if you take time and if you have Google Translate, you can read it so quickly because it's open access online. After my PhD, next slide, please. I started my postdoc fellow at Dutch Historisch Institute and also as part of a joint fellowship with the Harvard University Villa Itati. And now I'm working in Ghana at Bupe, in northern Ghana. Next slide, I will show you some picture of this site. So I'm studying the ceramics of Old Bupe, which is a really well-preserved site with really well-preserved architecture of the dating from the 16th century in northern Ghana. And I'm doing this work. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, yes. No. Okay, that was my hand.
No,
so,
no,
yeah.
No,
so,
that's why we have.
Yeah, sorry. So that's why I'm doing now. And so that is my path to become an archaeologist. And yes.
Perfect. Thank you, Jacques. I mean, I think it's an extremely interesting trajectory. And I also, one of the things that strikes me is the move from working on archaeology of architecture to looking more at small finds and kind of like developing your breadth as an archaeologist is really very interesting. Tunde, how about you?
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks to everyone for inviting us to this very wonderful seminar. I'm very much happy to be here. And thank you for that beautiful resume that you read. I almost not recognize myself as you were reading that. Like, oh, is he talking about me or someone else? Thank you so much. Yeah, for me, I think everything started as from childhood, even though it was a kind of, unconscious interest as a child. My dad loves to take us to the museums, having grown up in the Lagos, the heart of the city in Nigeria. And Lagos has a lot of, beautiful museums where you can go. So those are the places where my dad, as a child, would take us to. Of course, we love the space, the museum spaces, running around between, objects, between different form of installation as a way of kind of sticking to your memory, unconsciously. However, when it got to the point of having to decide what to do in the university, my dad's choice and prayer for all of his kids was for all of us to be accountants. And he thinks that is the only professional stuff that is there and can give you the kind of support and the kind of what he thinks is right for you. However, I couldn't force it. I thought I was going to be an accountant. I studied so hard in my bookkeeping and accounting class, and I love accounting. Up to today, I still love it, but I do it in different ways now. So however, I found myself in archaeology, where at the University of Ibadan, where I studied for my bachelor's. Ibadan is unique for one thing, and that's actually what gave me my foundation in archaeology. Unlike most other universities in Africa, where you have archaeology mostly in the humanities, in Ibadan, the archaeology is both in humanities and sciences, so which allows you to take classes in the archaeological science aspect of it, and also humanistic aspect of archaeology. And secondly, Ibadan is also the only place at the time that has a department of archaeology and anthropology. So even though you have background in science, but the kind of archaeology you are getting is the version of American anthropological archaeology, So this kind of, prepares you gives you a very broad, foundation, and opens up your thinking and gives you different options on what to do, where to go, if you want to continue in the path. And after my undergraduate, I continued for my master's at Ibadan, where I picked interest in, just like Jacqueline, I picked interest in looking at cultural landscape, looking at ditches and embankment fortifications in Yoruba land, which I excavated across one of those ditches and embankments in the a settlement called the Egbafore settlement, which was actually built as a response to the Atlantic influence in the 16th, 17th century. So that was how I started my journey in academic archaeology. And from there, I started picking interest in so many other things, and I applied to graduate school in the US, and I was privileged to have been accepted by Susan McIntosh at Rice University, who did the great work at Mali. She and Rod McIntosh did the work in Mali in late 70s, in Geno, which of course laid the foundation of what we know about study of urbanism, and the city in West Africa today. So I was privileged to work with her, and of course, my interest shifted from looking at fortifications, embankments, to looking at objects of, curiosity, so to speak. I was actually in between deciding what to do for my PhD between glass and iron. And of course, I decided to go for glass, and then one of the things that actually prompted me to go for glass was this idea that Africans were kind of non-inventive, and I was actually curious to look at how the technology of glass was actually developed. Not of course in this idea that every high technological material came into West Africa from outside was one of my strong reason why I wanted to see that. And at the time, an article was published in 2016 by James Lacton, Akin Ige, and Tiloren, that talks about the possibility of indigenous glassmaking in Ile-Ife. And I decided to check that out. Is the hypothesis right? Are they putting forward a kind of a strong possibility for understanding this technology in West Africa? And that was how I picked up interest in that. And of course, after PhD, like Sarah, read in my CV, I've had quite a number of fellowship, in Harvard, at University of Cambridge, in UCL, Qatar. And one interesting thing for me now, which I do currently, is shifting from glass technology to copper metallurgy. Currently, I'm working on the copper metallurgy in West Africa, looking at the technology, production, and exchange of copper alloy objects from around 500 BC through around the 1800 AD. So this is for me to kind of understand the complexity in, how technologies actually worked in the past. This notion that as archaeologists, we're kind of tempted to look at technology as a discrete, event, entity on their own, glass being glass, pottery being pottery by pottery makers and stuff. So I'm actually interested in looking at how these technologies crossed, in terms of ideas, in terms of technicalities. And I think diving into copper alloy is a kind of a good way to start looking at the relationship between copper alloy casters and also glass makers in the medieval West Africa. Permit me to use the word. Thank you, Sarah. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Tunde. In a lot of ways, my next question for you both was going to be to talk about what you think of as your most exciting discovery. So you've kind of brushed over it a bit quickly, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more about the work that you've done and maybe the type of evidence that you mobilized for the great discovery that you did about endogenous glassmaking in Ile-Ife.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I hope I'm going first, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. And I think this is a very dear question to me and a dear, research that is so dear to me. Like I said earlier, I started working on technology of glass. And one of the, so to speak, interesting things I think I've found is trying to distill this technology of glass making in sub-Saharan Africa for the first time, having evidence, of local indigenous glass making, as opposed to glass working. So these are two different processes. Glass making is the very initial stage whereby the maker is concerned with the quality of the raw materials to make glass, and is concerned with making raw glass. Many a times is not concerned with what object am I going to make out of this glass. It's just like, I want to make glass, a glass chunk or glass ingots, as we have it in other parts of the world. And when it comes to glass making, is the kind of a secondary process that at times is referred to as a secondary glass working. So glass working has to do with modifying existing raw glass to make, objects of a desired out of it. So it could be vessels, it could be, it could be beads, it could be bracelets, it could be anything, it could be whatever, So these two processes, most of the time in archaeological context, we don't find them, coexisting in the same workshop, because most of the time the glass makers are only interested in making the glass and then sell it or trade it, in raw form as glass ingot or glass chunk, pass it on to the artisan, who are then concerned with modifying that, remelting it, to make different type of object of desire out of it. But what we found in Ife is a site that has evidence of combination of glass making and glass working in the same workshop. And that in itself is not novel, but what is super novel in the findings is that for the first time, we have evidence that in medieval, I think we're permitted to use the word, so in medieval sub-Saharan Africa, for the first time, we have evidence of indigenous glass making, which means that they actually developed their own recipe for glass themselves, as opposed to this idea that the glass object must have come from somewhere and the artisan were only reworking imported glass, not making the glass themselves. So now we are able to understand through laboratory analysis, chemical composition analysis, to understand the chemical components of these materials. We're able to figure out that they were actually combining very distinctive raw material, in making this glass, which is very different from what we know from other parts of the world. For example, from ancient, from late ancient Egypt, from the Mediterranean, from the Levant, from the Roman world, from the Islamic world. These are places popular for glass making. And the reference to glass making in sub-Saharan Africa has always been linked to this, glass workshop. So for the very first time, we have this evidence that in 11th century AD, they were making glass from the raw material in Ile-Ife. And among the findings are crucibles, which is a kind of a ceramic vessel, is what you see in the image on the top left of the screen. And below that is a fragment of a crucible, fragment of what you see in the complete, or near complete at the top. And what is interesting about the fragment is that substance that is stuck to the bottom of it, and which is referred to as the semi-finished glass. So semi-finished glass is the kind of the intermediate stage of glass making, when you just start to bring your raw materials together and you fire it at a low temperature for the raw material to coagulate to form a mass. So at that stage, you still have, if you are careful enough in the laboratory, you can still separate all the raw materials that were brought together to make that mass. And they're seeing that on archaeological site is actually a very strong indicator of primary glass making, which you don't get to see anywhere. I mean, most places, So finding that inside a fragment of the crucible is a very significant find, which actually, addresses the issue of indigenous glass making in Ile-Ife from around the 11th century up to the 15th century. And of course, we found a whole lot of glass beads, completed, well-finished one, and some that are within at the intermediate stage, they are yet to be finished. So which shows that at this site, they were making both glass making and also glass working coexisted at this site, which is really novel. And of course, we also have evidence of the furnace in form of the furnace pit, the pit that are associated with the furnace. We have quite a number of them arranged in a very special way that point at being used in glass making. So these are the evidence we have and the kind of the discovery I have made in the last 12 or so years that I think is still very much relevant, and it speaks to so many things about how we understand and how we study African history and African past. And of course, in the course of this,
so I'll get, excuse me, I'll interrupt you there.
Sure.
I'll interrupt you there because we'll get back on you're getting ahead. I want to ask you specifically about what you were just going to say, but maybe first we can move to Jacques and his work, because I think like your both of your work and how it sort of positions itself vis-a-vis the previous historiography is really quite fascinating. So Jacques, what would you say your best discovery is?
Thank you, Sarah. When I started my training as an archaeologist, I was reading some European travel accounts from the 70th, 80th, and 19th century. And I came across this beautiful image of an African fortification called Tata. This is from Tianhi in actual Ivory Coast. And as you can see on the image, you have many people who was walking around this fortification. You have soldiers on it, for sure, but you also have some people who was walking just outside this fortification. So this image for me was a kind of sign that gave me the clue to know that fortification was really important in Africa, because at the beginning, when I started school, we were just talking about European fortification. I'm pretty sure that everybody know about Guérin or Elmina in Ghana or other European castles like this. But nobody told me about the African indigenous fortification. So when I came across this image, I was still, that means maybe somewhere you can find the remain of this fortification. So that's where my interest about fortification starts. And when I look in Cameroon, I found the fortification in Fumban. And later, when I go in Senegal, I was looking on the remains of this fortification in the landscape, but it was not easy to find them because most of the time this village was more than disappeared since the European colonization have destroyed all this fortification. But finally, after several surveys, we find some remain hidden by the vegetation, as you can see on the image. And I start to say, that means maybe not, if I excavate here, I will not find anything. But fortunately, next image, please. When I start after the cleaning, yes, you can have this really beautiful image for me of the screen of the wall. And then if you can move, please. When we dig this remains, we found more or less really well preserved foundation of the wall. And as you can see on the right, yes, this wall even have low falls. If you remember the first image I showed you, there were low falls on the wall. So this low falls was not only on the top of the wall, but even on the base. And that's for me, it was really beautiful, and I can still show this image because the day I was not sure to get the remain of the fortification in the landscape, but then I found them and I excavated and I found the foundation, and you can see this foundation have you can even make a technological approach of this fortification to know how they use stones and mute to build the wall. And because most of the time, the description we have in European traveler accounts just give some details about the mute fortification, but not so much about the fortification made with stones. And finally, this European travel account gives an image of an African people who just use mute to build fortification and who start to use stone only with after the contact with European, which is not actually true, because some of the fortification I excavated in Senegal date before the construction of the European fortification on the Atlantic coast. So for me, that was really great. And later, while studied fortification, I also learned that this fortification was most of the time the political center of policies, and it also gives an idea about the urbanization in Western Africa before the creation of European cities like Dakar and most of the time this African fortification was the kind of center who helped to control even the trade between different polities, because inside the fortification, when you have a fortification, soldiers and traders can stay there, and they can take this place as a place of resting during the journey for trading. So it's also linked all the economic landscape in Western Africa and the beginning of the urbanization in this area. Yeah.
I mean, it's so fascinating, and looking at this architecture is really, I think, like, to me, it's very, very exciting. And for our audience, maybe it's worthwhile just underscoring that the Falémé tributary of the Senegal River is thought to be one of the alluvial sources of gold for trans-Saharan trade in the Middle Ages. And so really a site of gold production that has like global significance in the centuries prior to this fortification. So thinking too about fortifications, you know, not only as political defensive mechanisms, but of safeguarding trade routes, as the point that you ended on is, I think, really exciting and significant for thinking about the infrastructure that was supporting interregional exchange at the period. Yeah. So that maybe brings us then to my next question, which is, you both told us about your really exciting research. And I wanted to kind of ask specifically, and Tunde was getting into this, about how your discoveries have pushed back against biases in the scholarly literature from the colonial and also the post-colonial period. I think both of you have been, the work that you've been doing and the types of questions that you've been asking are really explicitly pushing against some of the long-held assumptions in the scholarly literature. And I would just like to hear you speak about that a little bit. So maybe Jacques, since we're with you, we can keep on talking about your material.
Okay. Yes. For me, the working on fortification led me to work on the slave trades, Then we used to talk about marronage and resistance to the slavery in America and Caribbean, but most of the time we don't really think about the provenience of the enslaved people, because when you read the major literature of on the slave trade, you will also start on the coast,
Right.
but we never ask where did enslaved people came from. So working on fortification inside in the Falime Valley led me to work on the slave trade. Then I start, when questioning people about the use of the fortification, it finally appeared that it was also a tools used to resist to the raids and to the capture during the slave trade. Because when we are looking, next slide, please. Yes, I've already talked about the marronage. Next, please. Sorry. Oh, oops. Okay, you can stop there.
No?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't. Yeah. Yes. So I was working. So this questioning led me finally to see in the literature, we can till now people don't used to think that the enslaved African was just like a shtetl where raiders and traders just came and picked some people to enslave them and take them as captive to bring them in America. But thanks to my work, we can now see that these people used to defend themselves by building fortification, but not only by building fortification. We still have in some region, like in the Sine Saloum in Western Senegal, we have people who are using the landscape to defend themselves. They can weaponize the nature, use bees or even use trees to defend themselves, to be taken as a captive and to be enslaved during the time of the slave trade. So for me, we have to take more time if you are working on slave trade. Yes, you have to take more time to go deeper inside to see the influence and the consequence of the slave trade, not only along the coast, but also inside Africa. Oops.
Sarah, can you hear us?
Okay, yeah, am I back? Apologies for that. My internet connection was out a little bit, but Jacques, I was able to hear a lot of that material, which I think is, deeply fascinating, really kind of profoundly empowering as well. And so Tunde, you kind of started answering this question already about how your work pushes back against some deeply held presumptions in the literature, and I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. Of course, I started mentioning a little bit of it earlier, but I would like to emphasize 2 points here. These are important points that are so important when it comes to African historiography and how is being, taught and how is being presented in the past. And one of these one of these points is that the assumption is, first of all, the notion of a timeless Africa, non-inventive, innovative kind of, and it's kind of amazes me when I see that when it comes to development and invention of stone tools, Africa is undoubtedly credited for that. But when it kind of gets more sophisticated, more advanced, then the discussion shifted away from Africa. Then you started talking about some kind of external influence, talking about development of iron in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at development of copper metallurgy, and of course, as well as glass. And one of the things, very strong assumption that my work has, kind of a pushback on is this notion of technological invention. Why do people innovate, and what actually, prompts us to innovate? Does innovation always, most of the time, come with, contact, transfer of, technology from one person, superior person, to the other? So what I have been able to establish in my work is that innovation is humanistic, is not racist. Irrespective of who you are, you can develop by yourself and you can come up with a lot of ideas by yourself. And that is actually tested in understanding how this glass in Ife was made. And the image on the screen, the two charts on the left, and I'm sorry, the bottom left chart that has two circles, I think the top circle is kind of misplaced. But the main thing that I want to show in this chart is that it actually compares, the top one compares the rubidium and the potassium in the glass in Ife, in the glass from Ife, and compares it with the glass from late Bronze Age Egypt and also the Roman world. And rubidium is more connected with the geological materials, which is usually most of the time local. And it shows that there is a stark difference between the glass from Ife, which is the one circled on top, and those from late Bronze Age Egypt and also the Roman world. So this idea that all this glass in sub-Saharan Africa actually came from outside and they were remelted and remodified, to make different stuff in sub-Saharan Africa is now being pushed back. Now we know that, of course, there might be a little bit of kind of a difference in time period. It would have been earlier somewhere and later at other places, which of course, I often use this example of a technology of bread, baking bread. Bread is eaten all over the world and is baked differently. The recipe is different. And how do you say that the bread, Italian bread, is better or superior than the Nigerian bread, for example? When they are baked differently, they kind of use different recipes. So each of these technologies are unique in and of themselves within their locality. We can talk about the question of how well spread they are, but the question of the novelty of this material is definitely clear. And I've stated that in my articles, and some of them are what you are seeing on the screen. And of course, the same thing has to do with the chart on the lower bottom, left of the screen, comparing this same recipe. And another thing the second thing I will touch on is the next slide, please. Is the question of trade and long distance trade, regional trade, and the different form of interaction in Middle Age West Africa. When you look at the typical conventional maps of a trans-Saharan trade in West Africa, the Sahel is actually painted. That's where you see the cluster of the trade routes, the objects, the cities, and everything, and nothing seems to be happening in the southern community, the forest zone. So why is that? Is that really what happened on the ground? So with this glass, technology of glass and the glass bead making in Ile-Ife, now we've been able to push back the idea that everything prestigious came from outside. Now we know that Ife was also making glass, and the glass bead made in Ife in the 11th century were actually circulated across the major West African trading centers from around the 11th century, up to the 14th, 15th century. And the map on the right shows Ife in red, and you see other places where Ife made glass bead has been found across West Africa. And the arrows is actually to point at the, kind of hypothetical directions at which this glass bead will have traveled. So it's not impossible that we still have this glass bead that traveled all the way north, to the Mediterranean, and even making it across, and also even making it across to the Americas. And that's why I have that arrow pointing south, on the Atlantic there, because that point actually represents a Milner Castle in Ghana, which we all know that is a popular slave, coast in the 17th century. So if this glass bead actually made it to the coast of Mina, so how are we not so sure that it's actually crossed across the Atlantic into the Americas? Of course, not much is being done in terms of understanding the chemical composition of the glass bead in the enslaved African, quarters in the Americas. Of course, there is a brilliant work on the cultural significance of a blue glass bead from enslaved African, quarters I think in Georgia and other southern communities in the United States. We can see that it's a kind of cultural connect, and the southern part of West Africa, the forested zone, is not excluded from that, movement, from that interaction, from that, social complexity and economic complexity, political complexity that was going around, during the time period that we are interested in. I think I will stop there. Those are the two assumptions that I would like to I'm happy to answer questions during the Q&A section. Thank you.
Thanks, Tunde. That's absolutely fantastic. And I'm just going to repeat, I think, a very quotable quote of yours, which is, innovation is humanistic, not racist. I think everyone should write that down. That's fabulous. Well, both of your let's say, arguments with the previous literature leads in a way to my next question, which is about more of our modern institutions. And so archaeology, very much like the critique that is mounted against museums today, is frequently framed as a colonial endeavor. You are both doubly African archaeologists. You both grew up on the continent, and you now study its deep past. So what I want to ask is, how do you think your education and your subjectivity have the power to change the field moving forward and sort of respond to the critiques that are being waged against archaeology? And Tunde, maybe we'll continue with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I think in response to that, I would like to reiterate that archaeology in West Africa is colonial. It's a colonial endeavor. There is no doubt about that. And to some people, when they see us, Africans in space, but I think a whole lot of misinterpretation, a lot of historical havoc has been caused by some African, intellectual trying to stay away from discourses like, discipline like archaeology. And I think by my positionality and my subjectivity in the discipline, what it has actually, what it has actually done for me is for me to begin to see, African past, through a very different lens, trying to, on the one hand, it creates this kind of a self-awareness, for us. I mean, Janquin's work is very, very, novel and significant, talking about, who actually construct all these fortifications, I mean, all over you know, I'm going to mention Great Zimbabwe somewhere along the line. If we get there, you know, this narrative was very common at the time that, oh, all these beautiful fortifications, you know, beautiful structures, architecture, masterpiece were not built by Africans. And if Africans are staying away from discipline like this, the truth will never be told. And we will continue to kind of follow the same trajectory, the same conventional history, the same way of looking at, you know, historical past. And another, yes, it's okay, you can go to the next slide, thank you. And another way of, you know, looking at archaeology for me as African is that it helps us to kind of question so many things, you know, bringing the idea of indigenous epistemology into understanding archaeological process. You know, how would my ancestors think about these things? How did they feel about these things? You know, how did they navigate the landscape that I'm also currently navigating? So that kind of, you know, ingesting what my ancestors actually felt about a space, you know, helps me to understand it better from kind of an inner kind of perspective compared to the external kind of perspective. And of course, that also helps to build capacity, intellectual capacity in dealing with this very critical debate and issue that is currently going around about repatriation, restitution, reconciliation, because if you are not well equipped in this, so to speak, colonial discipline, from looking at it from our own indigenous perspective, applying what Olupono called indigenous amenities in understanding these archaeological findings and features, we will never be able to engage, you know, meaningfully in these debates and also contributing in a very novel and a meaningful way. And currently, I'm working with Professor Pauline on, you know, producing an edited volume on archaeology, heritage, and the decolonization of African past. And I think these are the kind of very important debate and question that we need to ask ourselves. And we as Africans, we should be able to contribute to this kind of debates. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, thank you, Tunde. That's really powerful. Jacques, how would you respond to that?
As Ogatunde say, I totally agree with him. Archaeology in Africa is a colonial discipline and its beginning. Because if I can talk about the French-speaking countries in Africa, archaeology started there with a colonial officer. They were all trained at the École Coloniale Française, and in their mind, because they were in the process of colonization, they were trying to understand people they will now govern in courts. So that's where they start to be interested about the culture, and they start to look about materials. Then, and during the beginning of the 20th century, there was this exhibition called in French Exposition Coloniale. There was in France, in German and Belgium and all over the Europe. And during this exhibition, they try to select the most beautiful artifacts and, of course, unfortunately human, who was representative of some tribes in Africa, and they exhibit them as artifacts in Europe. And even today, this most of in the continuity of this process, you can see that most of the French researchers are still working in French-speaking countries. I know just few exceptions like Gérard Chouin, who is working in Nigeria or in Ghana, but most of the time, when you will see a Belgian archaeologist, he will work in Congo, a French archaeologist will work in Mali or in Senegal, and things like this. And if we can move, but as Ogatunde also say, we as African researchers, we have to go inside this colonial endeavor, but to bring our conception, which is totally different, to see things in another perspectives. And I think that is the base of what we call today community engagement, because as you can see on the image, we were digging in, this is in one photo, one image of one of the site where we work in eastern Senegal. The site is Koussan. And when we found some pottery in our trench, the woman with the red shirt outside, she's a potter. It's an actual potter. So she came, and when she saw it, she started to describe the decoration on it, and she even described the techniques directly just when she saw it. But this was, if I remember, if I'm not mistaken, this pottery was from the 70th century, if I don't mistake. If it's not 70th century, it's 80th century. So as you can see, this is a direct connection between the community and the archaeologist, because at the beginning, this discipline was to bring African to European, but now we are trying to make it first for the community where we are working. That's why you can see now, most of the time, archaeologists are really engaged and try to involve all the community in the research. And it's a kind of way to reappropriate the culture and also bring a new path of interpretation on all the material we are excavating now, because most of the time we are using to interpret the culture, we are using the theory made outside Africa, like structuralism, post-processualism, and all other ones. But if we take the time to discuss with people, we also have we can capture how they see the world and how they interpret this world in the material culture. So as an African, I think this is our contribution, not only in African archaeology, but also around the world, because now even the UNESCO is trying now to involve all the community in the preservation of the site or knowledge and all other things like this. I think it starts because African researchers try to involve community in their research, and they don't try to be separate, to have this kind of distance between the object and the subject. So yes, definitely the field will change with the time.
Yeah. And I think changing more there is kind of a broader participation in the field. It really has to do with the actors who are doing the work that is essential. And one of the things that I wanted to bring out a bit, Jacques, from your point and some of what Tunde was saying, and just kind of highlight this for the audience, is this tension in dealing with African history between tradition and innovation. And I think that this is really important right now, especially kind of in light of a lot of Tunde's work and people that are putting an emphasis rightly on technological innovation, and on the other hand, a sort of the importance of oral histories and a continuity of tradition, a shared tradition over time, and balancing these two realities within archaeological and, you know, for me, an art historical approach, being open to spontaneous innovation and change, and yet also respecting a deep tradition that is recognizable over time, and trying to, as historians, as people who are interested in the deep past, scholars interested in the deep past, balancing those two ends of the spectrum to make sense of the evidence that's coming to the fore. I think that's really, really important. So My next question is moving away from each of your own works, as exciting as it is. And I wanted to ask you about your kind of colleagues' work. Like, what are you excited about that other people are interested in? And what do you think are kind of promising directions that the field is moving into? And maybe Jacques, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Sarah. From my point of view, I think one of the most promising direction is about underwater archaeology, because it's now growing, and I'm also happy to see that some many African archaeologists are really interested in, because as you can see, Africa is just surrounded by water. And we all know that even during the slave trade, when you have to transship enslaved people from the land to the board, or merchandise from the land to the ship, we can lose most of the thing. So doing underwater archaeology in Africa will be really interesting, because it will give new material, and will also help to bring new knowledge, not only on along the coast, because sometimes people think that Africans are not sailor, if I can say that. But if you see the Niger River, there was a lot of town around along this river, but you cannot live near the river and not use it. And if you use the river, probably you will lose some material inside, and it's the job of the archaeologists to find it today. And another way is the development of new methodologies and use of new tools, either in Africa or by African researchers, because most of the time, people, and it's also, this is another kind of colonial thought, they think that in the forest, Africa, it's more or less possible to find archaeological site, because you have the vegetation, you cannot even find all the organic remains, because it's heavy raining and the soil is acid, and you have all these kind of arguments. But with these new tools, we will be probably more able to find new sites and develop new methodologies to discover new materials, and we will probably, I'm sure, we will definitely go to the new direction. Of course, I will not talk about museum, because sometimes we just forget that museum is the second part of the archaeology. Yes, but of course now many Africans are really involved in museum, and that's great. But you have to think about the beginning with archaeology. Yeah.
Jacques, I really love the point, and I want to underscore that there's all of these excuses that are made in the field for why archaeology in Africa isn't effective, or whatever, and underscoring that that's because this is a foreign tool that is being brought onto African soil, and rather, if we're thinking about growing tools out of this environment, that the potential for adapting and really actually having the technological ability to find these things that have always been the excuses, it doesn't persist, and the acidic soil, for example. I love that point. I think that's really, really powerful. Thank you. Tunde, what do you think? What are the future directions for the field?
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. And I think I will pick pick up from where Jacques actually stopped, talking about the importance and the impact of technology in taking archaeology forward in Africa. But beyond that, because like we both said earlier, archaeology by nature is colonial, and so is methodologies. And unfortunately, its methodologies, or most part of its methodologies, are very rigid. It's just like a mathematical or chemistry equation, which cannot be changed the way you arrange them. You're still going to get the same results, but what can be changed, which I am really happy of that is really changing, is how do we process this data, and how do the process of the knowledge production aspect of it, what story do we want to tell, how do we approach the interpretation techniques of making these materials meaningful to people, and of making this material to tell the right and genuine African history, that is not really encapsulated in these colonial baggages, So I think there is a very, very impressive vigor and fresh ideas currently going around the whole of African continent, unveiling aspects of African past that has been before now subdued. One of those fresh ideas really going on is, I will mention the work of Oyugi, who just published this book on the left side of the screen, titled The Yoruba, A New History. The book is really a new history, because when you look at the way history of Yorubas, of course, like other African, people and group, is been written before now, most of them were written in a way that is very, very biased to so many things. But this book, Oyugi himself being an archaeologist and speaking, authoritatively about, historical historical discourses in a way that is very innovative, very engaging, is so marvelous, and I love it. These fresh ideas and how old data are being reappropriated, reinterpreted, and how they are being reprocessed is something that I think is really, really interesting. And of course, it's the same thing with the work of Klapati Mavunga. He's of course, he's historian of technology, but he writes in a way that it speaks to contemporary issues. In one of my articles, the one published in International Journal of Historical Studies on the creativity, I opened the article with a quotation from Mavunga's books, where he talks about what kind of African history are we telling? Enough of this history of Africa that dwells so much on servitude, on poverty, on impoverishment, on scarcity and stuff. Is that everything that defines us as African? Where do we put the story of myth making? Where do we put the story of resilience? Where do we put the story of innovation and invention? Means making, survivor and stuff like that. And I think that is one thing that I think archaeology, African archaeology, is now really doing really well, telling the story from the other side of the spectrum, going beyond, impoverished story, but now talking about stories that embellishes African history. And of course, the work of Olanrewaju Lasisi is groundbreaking. He just finished his PhD and he started working on the archaeology of cultural astronomy, in Yoruba land, where he engages archaeological material to understand how Africans, understand understand time, understand space, and understand movement of time and stuff like that. Those are very innovative ideas coming out of African archaeologists and African scholars. And of course, the recent book published by Jacques Aymeric on Great Zimbabwe, we all know the story of Great Zimbabwe, the enclosures, the architectures being accredited to Europeans and other foreigners. But this book actually puts that kind of a narrative to rest by simply reinterpreting the data, digesting the data, regurgitating and kind of reprocessing it to come out of this great idea. So one thing I see, the movement I see going forward is that this new way of processing old data to address issues that are connected with contemporary things, talk about, climate change, talk about resilience, talk about development, sustainability, these are the directions which I see African archaeology, and it's so, amazing to me. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, that's super exciting to think about all of those questions and how they'll play out in writing the future of this discipline. And so we just have we have 5 minutes left before we're going to move to the question and answer period. So really quickly, I would like each of you to say, for the teachers who are listening, who are going to be passing on some of this knowledge to school kids, what is like the one thing you would suggest to kids who are interested in this material? What should they do? What is a path to working on the material that you are each dedicating your lives to doing? What can they do now as school kids, as high school kids, to move in your footsteps, let's say? And I guess Tunde, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, of course, I'm happy to do that. And I think one of the things I would talk about is creating the opportunity. Is actually two ways. One way is teaching a very kind of inclusive teaching, the teaching that is not biased, in its form or in its structure. When the educators are assigning, for example, articles for students to read, they should try as much as possible to include articles that were written by Africans. When you are teaching African history and you look through the list of the resources in the syllabi, and what you see is just white people everywhere writing African history, and you are talking about African history without referencing a single, article by an African. And more importantly, of course, for Jacqueline and I, who are in North America or in Europe, we have more accessibility. But I think there are very much, rich resources, being produced by scholars who are based in Africa. I don't know how, but I think trying to access those kind of resources is also very, very important. There is a lot of primary resources there, archival materials, newspaper cutting. There is a lot of secondary resources as well, locally published journals, So I will encourage them to try to focus on this aspect. And a second thing is to encourage the students to participate in the field schools, maybe volunteer in field schools, maybe around them. They don't have to travel, maybe if there's any work going on around them, and they can encourage them to participate, because there is a kind of a power in seeing, in experiencing stuff, So when you experience it yourself, when you see it yourself, then there is this kind of a, you see it in different ways, and it also helps you to think about it in different ways. So I would just stop on that. Thank you. Thank you, Tunde.
Jacques, what would be your advice?
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for this question. As Tunde had already highlighted some points, I will just remind, if you can go to the next slide, that the true size of Africa. And most of the time we used to forget that. I know from United States, we used to see Africa as a country. It's just, that's the first one. But even if you want to see Africa as a country, it's a really large country. So most of the places in this country have never been explored. even now, I know there are some African countries where you can, for about archaeology, you can just have 1 or 2 sites who are excavated. Yes, it's not some of the place like Nigeria or Ghana or Senegal are really well studied, but you also have some country like CIA, Central African Republic, or Gabon or Congo, who can just have 2 or 3 dots on the map. And just recently, a country like Sao Tome and Principe have never been surveyed archaeologically. It's just recently that archaeologists start to be interested on these 2 islands. So we can encourage kids to know that if they are involved in African archaeology or in African research, they will still have material to study, and they will bring more. Their study will bring more contribution to knowledge than those who study other parts of the world. I'm not saying that it's not good to study Europe, but I'm pretty sure that they will bring more knowledge by studying Africa than going to add a little dots in Europe or in, I don't know, Byzantine archaeology. Please, next slide. Also, when talking about Africa, as Babatunde already said, when we are talking about stone tools or about the first human, Africa is on the top. But when it's coming the time to talk about the urbanization and the technology innovation and all this stuff from the later period, Africa just disappear.
Yeah.
We don't know. There was nobody in Africa during this period. I'm not sure. So we have to remind that if today we are not talking about even when we are talking about the great empire in West Africa, we have some, I don't know, in French we used to say potatoes, but you can have just a drawing just showing Mali Empire, Ghana Empire, but it looks like for the rest of the place, there were nobody there, which is not true. If until now, we cannot make a real political map of Africa, but I don't like take an example of the 15th century, just because we are not yet explored all this place. That for sure, there were people there, where we have to know who was there, so we can also place them on the map, and this will be great for knowledge. And if we can move to the next slide, please. I will not talk too much about, because Babatunde already talked about archaeological field school, which is a really good experience, and you can learn so much by doing things really with your classmate, and it's more easy for archaeologists to explain their discipline when we are in the field school, because most of the time archaeologists used to talk in a really incomprehensible language, but on the field, it's really easy to take an object and to describe it with the really simple word, which will be great. I think this, and also we have to be curious. Today we have all this social media, and I don't know if you have to say Twitter or X now, or YouTube or anything you want, I'm pretty sure that you will find a channel where some archaeologists are doing promotion about archaeology, about anthropology, about Africa history, and you have to be really mind open. So don't just focus on one of these social media, because the knowledge is not unidirectional. You have to build it from many different perspectives. So yes, I think that's the part.
Yeah, that's great. Those are wonderful suggestions. So really the importance of field schools. And I underscore that there's lots of field schools across the United States that teenagers can go to get local knowledge. And then I think, Jacques, your point of like not, that the internet is full of information, and to be curious and to not just stay in your little corner, but to explore some of these topics, I think is a really good point. So thank you both. That was really fascinating. You both brought a huge amount of material to the table, and I have a million questions, so audience will as well. So with that, I'm going to pass the chair, the symbolic chair, over to Helen to handle the question.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, Tunde and Jacques, for just a magnificent discussion. I love the way that you brought it back to K through 12 teachers and what can teachers do and take away from this. We do have some questions. Let's get right to them in the chat area. One was, we'll start, did Christopher Columbus arrive in South America in 1452, or was it a different date, perhaps 1492? Second question, as a specialist in African history, I'd like to know what your ideas are about medieval West Africa. Is it a periodization, European, Eurocentric, or is it more specific to Africa? We'll start with those two. Christopher Columbus arriving, the year, and your understandings of what is medieval Africa. Jacques, Tunde.
It's okay. Can I go? Yeah, well, for me, I think the question of the time Christopher Columbus arrived South America, I think the question say, I'm not sure exact dates, exact time. And I think the person refers to Sarah saying 1452, and then it's actually 1492 or something. I don't know if, I don't know exact dates anyway, but of course, it's a kind of a common knowledge that Christopher Columbus arrived, sometimes in the late 15th century. So maybe Sarah can see exactly what she meant to say in her introduction anyway. But on the issue of medieval, I think Sarah was also very explicit in her introduction, talking about,
sorry, my internet connection, that was just a slip up through now.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Mm.
So,
Yes.
as I was saying, I said, I think Sarah was also very clear in the introduction, talking about medieval and how we interpret it, particularly for the purpose of this seminar. It's not a term that we are kind of intellectually approved of, but of course, it's a kind of a term. Of course, everybody knows it's European, it's racist, it's not a true description of what happened in Africa, because Africa, like other continents, do have a very different historical trajectories. And the historical trajectories of each continent, each country needs to be taken, as is for the continent, not another continent as a measure for the other continent. But for the purpose of this seminar, and of course, at times, I also find myself using the word medieval. I think it's basically as a kind of a chronological bracket, a chronological kind of a definitional term, rather than saying that a kind of a concept that defines, a cultural manifestation or cultural tradition in Africa. No. So for me, it's a kind of a chronological marker, because we think of, in what we do, messaging is very important, presentation is very important. If I'm talking to, for example, with this group of educator in, American kind of history class, talking about some terms and some time periods may not be something that, they are really aware of or familiar with. In that context, I use the word medieval, and I quickly go on to say that, oh, when I say medieval, I mean this time period from, let's say, around the 800 AD to about, 1200, 1300 AD. That is what I mean, because it kind of brings, sparks something in their memory when you say medieval, rather than when I continue to say, oh, in the 10th century, in the 11th century, in 13th century, they kind of think of what exactly is. It's just like teaching about World War I, and you are saying 1925, 1920, 1924, rather than saying World War I. So when you say World War I, people kind of link, and follow that, rather than saying the exact date that happened. And of course, I'm really very much open to contrary opinions. I'm not in approve of the word medieval for African historiography, for African history, but occasionally, and I sparingly use it to define this time bracket, but not to define the cultural tradition and manifestation that actually happened within that period.
Yeah, thank you, Tunde. I will just agree with you, and it's also the same with the word pre-colonial, because as we used to sometimes just to make the discussion or the presentation easy, we can just say pre-colonial just to mean that is something that happened before this time period or this time period, but it doesn't mean that archaeologists approve or accept this periodization of the word, because in our purpose it doesn't represent anything. It's not the same definition, and even in archaeology itself, we have a lot of debates about the periodization in archaeology. We can talk about it for all the day, because sometimes we are using the Late Stone Age, the Old Stone Age, or we have to use Paleolithic or Neolithic and what it means. But finally, as Babatunde said before, we have to remind that each place have his own culture and his own view of the time. So it's important just to make it easy to sometimes accept that, so we can use this word with brackets. Thank you.
Great. There are a couple more questions. I'm going to group them in two. Sarah, did you have a comment? I saw your gesture.
Just very quickly, that a way of the kind of bringing back what Tunde and Jacques were saying. I use the sort of awkward term now, which is the period contemporaneous with the European Middle Ages, to both kind of draw on what people know and kind of an accepted body of like the knowledge that people have already, and then have all those extra words to underscore that this is a European concept, and that, applying it to Africa. So trying to have my cake and eat it too, I think, of using a word that communicates a time period in a shorthand, while also really emphasizing that it's not an endogenous.
You. Two questions to Tunde. Can you discuss how using a different size mesh helped your discoveries? Second question, Sarah and Tunde, or also Jacques, can you talk about the Caravans of Gold catalog and its value for teachers?
All right, I'm going first, right?
Yes, please.
So for my work in Ife, using very fine screen mesh really revolutionized what we discovered and what we were able to get at the site. And one of the ways it actually helped is that before now, people, scholars that have worked in Ife, they often, hunt for the artworks, because Ife, classical Ife, was very rich in, beautiful artistic tradition, the copper alloy figures, the terracotta work, the portrait pavement, and so many things like that. So I think I didn't understand their biases until I started working in Ife, that when you are working in such a very rich, environment, and everything you find is important and significant. So you have this, you are tempted to kind of overlook some things that are considered fragmented and tiny, and then focus on things that are very, imposing, the big, fascinating, beautiful, well-decorated, artwork, copper alloy shining, and, and then you forget about the other stuff. And I think at some point, not even all of them actually screened what they excavated. So in that way, they couldn't capture all these tiny, tiny glass beads, most of which are between 1.2 and 1.5 millimeters. And you can imagine, if you use the regular screen mesh, you are never going to catch all those. In fact, my experience in my first year was that I went there unprepared. And when we were confronted with this situation, so we had to improvise by using mosquito netting to capture those tiny glass beads. And in the first instance, we counted over 20,000 glass beads, which has never happened in Ife from a single site. And over 50% of that came from a single 1 meter by 3 meter, excavated unit, which was less than 1 meter deep. So you can imagine how dense it is. So that really helped us to capture a whole lot. And within that assemblage of different glass beads, we were able to differentiate which belong to which stage of production. And from there, we were able to reconstruct the chain, change the sequence of production of the glass bead itself. No, this is not talking about the glass making, but even the glass bead itself, from the time they cut the glass bead to the time they kind of try to treat it to, make the edge, round, up to the time whereby they string it and they do all the stuff. So if we had not done that, we would not have been able to capture that great number of glass beads. And then within that huge collection, we have different, varieties that actually points to different stages of production, which I think that was why, adopting that technique really was helpful for us. And of course, in subsequent years, I actually compromised because I felt like, okay, now we already know this, we already have this, so having a couple more is okay, but I don't want to spend another 4 months digging just 2 tiny units, just the name of trying to, to sort out those tiny glass beads among, sand grain and, gravel, and it actually took us a whole lot of time. So I think, yeah, I will stop there.
Yes, fascinating. Yes, we have to think about for instance, in Eastern Senegal, when I took the time, is one of the papers we publish next year with Dunbarton Ox. I took the time to reconstruct the map of African indigenous fortification at the end of the 19th century, just based on the travel accounts from the European traveler. And more or less, I think now I have more than 72 fortification just along the Faleme Valley. So if today we are not, when we look to the landscape, we are not seeing anything, it's just because we have not take the time to look and to search them. For my PhD, I looked and I found just 50 of them because the time was just really, for the PhD, you have to be focused and did what you have to do so directly. But I think if you take more time and go beyond, because this was just on the eastern, on the Senegalese part of the Falime Valley. So in the Mali part, we have to, I'm pretty sure that we also have more or less the same thing. And this is the part for the future research, because we is really needed to see why all this fortification just spread during the Atlantic era. It was not just because of the, and even it started before the Atlantic era. So you have to understand the process of urbanization in this Sahelian zone first. Then we also have to understand why in this place we don't have huge communities like in the southern forest part, like Nigeria, Yoruba lands. But we have all these small communities who want just to build one fortification for each village, instead to be reunited in one village and build something more bigger. So that is many questions we have to think about. Yeah.
Thank you. Just, I'm sure we're running out of time here, but there are just three very things I need to mention here. Is a question Karen Brown asked, is there a picture of the pottery shared she is looking at? I'm sure that can be answered in the chat. And just for, maybe we don't have time to answer it, but just to announce it. And why do African researchers continue to use that expression? I'm not sure which expression the participant is asking about. And last, but certainly not least, Dr. Catherine Quinlan, a colleague of mine, just published talking about inclusive education, focusing on resources, cultural and science resources pertaining to Africa and African American heritage. So I think we are at 11:50. But if there's any quick comments around that, but we are preparing to transition. Yes, Tunde.
Yeah, just a very quick comment on the why African researchers continue to use the expression. I think the person is talking about the word medieval. Which is what we started. So I think what I would just say quickly is that Africa is very vast. The historical trajectories in Africa is not similar in every part of the continent. And trying to develop a kind of a unifying concept for the whole continent will fall into the same pit that we are trying to run away from. You know, so I mean, even when you look at the development of iron metallurgy, for example, it's different. It varies from the whole continent, from one place to the other. So how do I define Iron Age Africa, for example? I find the definition of Iron Age Africa very problematic anyway, because in other places it's up to 19th century. In other places it's about 3,000 years ago. You know, so I think that's one of the very kind of challenges that we are facing. And that's why we think still continue to use this word and try to define what we mean about when we use it. And of course, we are very critical in using them anyway. Might still be the way to go at the moment, because we cannot develop a unifying concept for the whole of African continent. Thank you. I don't know if that's really helpful, but just wanted to that.
Or maybe we have to invite historians and to come and have a really huge conference with African archaeologists at the same place at the same times, and then all together we will choose the different dots on the history of all Africa and start to use these dots, because even for the European periodization is just the birth of Jesus Christ or the birth of Mahomet is just a dot on the history of the humanities. So we have to select which dots point we use to define a new periodization of African history. And to finish, I'd like to thank Sarah for this light slide she just put now, because I would like to pay tribute for people with whom I've worked and who lived where I used to work, and by saying them thank you. I know they are not online, but I acknowledge the knowledge they give me, and I'm sharing this knowledge with you today. So thank you, Aïe, merci, pour ceux qui parlent français, Jarama and Aniche.
Thank you, Jacques.
Dr. Bond, sorry to interrupt. There's also a question in the Q&A feature. I'm not sure if you noticed that.
Let's see here. I don't see.
At the bottom, there is the chat that you've been looking at, and also the Q&A features at the bottom as well.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I wasn't even looking at the Q&A feature. They were all coming, so many in on the chat. Okay, wonderful questions here. I've just last year, added glass beads into my lessons on trade in Africa and the Indian Ocean to show the need or to reach the global trade story. Is it easy for archaeologists to locate the origin of these beads, or is it possible that Arabian or Egyptian beads have been misidentified?
Yes, definitely. If I can quickly respond to that, glass bead is most misidentified, historical archaeological objects because of this first, notion that a glass bead is exotic material in sub-Saharan Africa. And when you see glass bead, they often connect it to, of course, like you said, Indian Ocean trade, Trans-Saharan trade, Mediterranean trade. Of course, that is true on the one hand, because glass bead was used as a currency at some point, and it was actually traveling and moving everywhere because of its size. You can have like a bunch on you without having to be weighed down, So it really moved around. However, looking just at, especially the monochromes, those that are not, without any design or any motif on them, you can easily misidentify them without having to study them chemically. And that is where chemical composition studies of those glass beads is very, very important. For Ife, they have been called so many names before now: trade wind beads, trade beads, seed beads, whatever beads, but now we know that a whole lot of them were actually locally made, So, and that is another question that's kind of related to the issue of medieval. So we have to, how do we name these different beads, without any distinctive, features on them, because they all look alike. If I put all those in a tray and give it to you to sort out, you will not be able to sort them out, So that is why using this, multidisciplinary approach in our studies is very, very important, from historical to archaeological science. That's how we have a very rich, narrative about what we're looking at.
Thank you. And I do see the question from Karen. It's both in the chat and the Q&A, so let's include that. Fascinating about the density of beads found in one area. Assuming all the beads were loose, could you tell if any of them had been put into a structure like bracelets, crowns, or had all of them been loose and traded as loose beads?
Yes, thank you. That's a very fascinating question. They are all recovered loose. And like I said, this is a kind of a production context workshop where the glass bead was being made. So I have this hypothesis about the fact that possibly the glass bead was not being strung at the site. Maybe they were just sewed, loose, maybe with a measure or something, because we didn't find any strong glass bead. However, somewhere else in Ife, which is also dated to around the 12th century. The site is called Itayemo, where Frank Willett worked in 1959, I think, or 56 or thereabout. He found one of those, crucible vessels with a strong glass bead and, stone bead on the inside of it. And of course, in my other work, I've actually interpreted that to be something different, but what I'm trying to say is that at the site where I'm working is a production site and everything is found loose. Nothing was found strong. And I think they would have been sold loose from the workshop to people where they would have been, strong and put together. There is no evidence of bracelets from my site. However, sometimes in the 70s, and Ife indigenous archaeologists, Professor Motosho Iluyemi, he did an ethnographic work in the 70s within Ife, and also from his early work in Ife in the early 70s, he mentioned recovering some of these, glass bracelets, but I did not find anything. And again, that kind of speaks to the question of methodology that I mentioned earlier. If they were not screening, or if they are only screening with huge meshes, they only pick those big items, and the big items we all have been collected, and the tiny ones were left out there, which is what I went there to capture, So yeah, in terms of how the beads were used. If you look at, I'm not sure the picture of any of Ife artwork is included in the presentation, but I think it's somewhere else, maybe in the lesson. You can see how some of these Ife artwork are decorated in beads representation, lavishly around their neck, dripping down up to their navel area, and around their wrist, around their ankle, and all these artworks are from Ife from around 12th, 15th century. And that actually speaks to the consumption and the uses of this glass bead. So there is a kind of connect between the evidence for the technology and also evidence for the use. So they were used in crown, like Karen said, they were used in crown, but one of the ways we know they were used in crown is because of their representation in the crown and headgear of these, copper alloy figures and also the terracotta figures. But we did not recover anything, in the context that suggests that they were actually sewn to crown. Yeah, thank you. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, can I just add quickly to that today is that while the digs at Ile-Ife didn't reveal objects, a lot of other sites, especially tomb sites from both close to Ife in Nigeria and in the surrounding region, some kind of quite far away, have shown mostly out of tombs that these objects were mounted on things like bracelets, belts, head covering. We do have kind of contemporary evidence, like from the historical past, of these being to objects from elsewhere.
Thank you. Okay, and we do have a mention of another resource in here on the horse in Africa. So there's another great resource there put in the chat. See, make sure I'm not missing any other questions. Glass bead manufacturer, is there information on smelting, on the formation of these beads? I think will be our last question. I'm sorry, today.
Yeah, I didn't get that. Can you repeat the question, please?
Yes, absolutely. Glass bead manufacturer, is there information on smelting or on the formation of these beads?
Yes,
Smelting or the formation.
Yes, there is information on the, when you say formation, I want to believe you mean like, the making, the production of the beads. Yes, and that was what I said earlier. When you recovered, the context of recovery of some of these materials is very, very important, and you have to understand the context for you to be able to, infer some interpretation. I mean, like Sarah said earlier, if you find all these well-made, well-finished beads from a tomb or from burial, of course, that was the kind of consumption context which will have been associated with the individual buried. And of course, it shows that glass bead will have also meant so many in the society where the buried individual belonged. But in this case, when you recover this number of glass bead, within a small area in loose form, and when you look at them, they are all not well-made, well-rounded. In fact, some of them, a whole lot of them still have very sharp edges, whereby if you try to even wear it the way they are, you're going to cut yourself, and then I don't think anybody will go to the market to buy that type of glass beads to use in his or her house or put on him or her. So that actually point is a strong indicator that we are dealing with a production context. And of course, there are other production apparatus that are connected to this glass bead. I mentioned the furnace pits that we uncovered. I mentioned the crucibles that were used in the glass making. I mentioned, different form of glass bead and also production waste. We have about 4 kilograms of production waste. And looking at this production waste, again, we were able to separate, each stages of production of the glass bead, because each stages of the production generates different form of waste. And for the first time, you don't find that kind of, very massive and convincing evidence on archaeological sites. So for the first time, we have this, and the clustering of all this together within this, so to speak, small space is a very strong indicator that we are dealing with production. So yes, we know how they were made. And in one of my articles, I think the one recently published in the Oxford Encyclopedia Research of Anthropology or something, I think I have a kind of a schematic kind of sketching on different stages of production and the tools and also the waste that actually attached to each stage of production, which shows the sequence of production for the first time in West African archaeology. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that. Okay, any party comments? I think we're probably ready to transition. I'll pass the next part of the agenda. We're getting ready to go into the breakout sessions.
Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you for staying. Thank you for doing the survey. Thank you for all the wonderful questions that you asked. And we are always available to you, whether you are in the Washington area or you are afar, to help you with teaching about Africa.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you so much for everything.
Thanks so much.